Before we begin, I want to welcome you to the channel. If you're new here, I'm glad you found us. If you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing. And before we get into today's story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The call came in at 2:47 in the morning, and Marcus Webb almost let it go to voicemail, because security guards weren't supposed to get calls at that hour unless something had already gone sideways. He picked up anyway, thumb hovering over the screen like it might bite him, and the voice on the other end belonged to Amber Collins from the third-floor nursing station, whispering so low he had to press the phone hard against his ear to catch it. She said someone was standing in the stairwell between floors 2 and 3, just standing there in the dark with the emergency lights cutting shadows across a face she swore she recognized but couldn't place. And she needed him to check it out, because there was no way she was walking down there alone. Not after what happened to Danny. Marcus had worked nights at Ashford Memorial for 6 years, long enough to know that Danny Prescott, a respiratory tech who'd clocked out for his break one October evening and never clocked back in, was not a name anyone brought up casually around the nurses' station. The hospital's official line was that he'd walked off the job, maybe had a breakdown, maybe met somebody in the parking garage who wasn't supposed to be there. His truck turned up 3 days later at a rest stop 40 miles east, keys still in the ignition, driver's door hanging open like he'd stepped out mid-sentence. Admin didn't like talking about it, but the night crew sure did. Low voices over cold gas station coffee. And what they said was that Danny had been poking around the old East Wing before he vanished, the part of the hospital sealed off since a fire gutted 3 floors back in the 70s, and that whatever he found down there had followed him out the door. Marcus took the elevator up rather than walk in blind, and when the doors opened, the hallway smelled faintly of burnt hair, a smell that had no business existing in a building with working smoke detectors and a fire system inspected twice a year. Amber was waiting at the nurses' station, arms crossed tight over her scrubs, not saying a word, just jerking her chin toward the stairwell door with its little wire-reinforced window. Through it, Marcus could see nothing but the dull orange glow of the emergency lights bouncing off empty concrete steps. He told her it was probably nothing, a trick of the light, some patient who'd wandered off, and she gave him a look that said she wasn't buying it for a second but appreciated him trying. He pushed through anyway, because that was the job. The stairwell was quiet, empty, exactly like he figured, nothing but the hum of the exit sign and his own breathing, which had gotten shallow without asking his permission first. 3 steps down, the temperature dropped hard enough to raise goosebumps under his sleeves, a cold that didn't belong to any HVAC system he'd ever serviced. And under it came that burnt smell again, stronger now, less like hair and more like scorched fabric, and something underneath that he didn't want to put a name to. He kept going anyway, because turning back felt worse somehow. And at the landing between 2 and 3, he found a single white nurse's shoe sitting upright against the wall, old school, rubber sole worn thin on one edge like somebody who favored a leg. He didn't touch it. Snapped a photo instead, the flash lighting the stairwell up white and throwing the shadows into a jump scare of their own. And when he lowered the phone, the shoe was gone. Not knocked over. Gone, like it had never been sitting there at all. And it was that, the flat-out absence of it, that finally sent him hauling up the stairs 2 at a time, radio dead on his belt because Amber had already gone quiet on her end. He didn't sleep worth a damn after that shift, and he didn't breathe a word of it to admin because Ashford had an unspoken rule that staff who reported this stuff got quietly moved to garbage shifts or, worse, not renewed when their contract came up. So Marcus sat on it, same as everybody else, until his buddy Jake from maintenance came to him 2 weeks later with a printout from the old records room downstairs, where anything too ancient to scan had been rotting in cardboard boxes since the 80s. Jake had been sent down to fix a leaking pipe near the archive when a folder split open on the floor, spilling old employee photos across the concrete, standard ID shots, names typed on the back in a font nobody used anymore. One stopped him cold. A young nurse in blue pinstripe scrubs and an old-fashioned cap, expression flat, unreadable. On the back, in faded ink, a name and a date. The name meant nothing to Marcus. The date did. Same date as the fire. They spread the rest of the folder out on the break room table like a couple of conspiracy nuts, and over the next hour pieced together a story the hospital had clearly spent 50 years trying to bury. The fire hadn't started on its own. Well, it had, but the reason 3 nurses died in it wasn't the blaze itself. It was a fire door on 3 that had been welded shut months earlier after a string of supply closet thefts. A cost-cutting call nobody bothered to reverse when the welding was only supposed to be temporary. The nurses trapped behind that door pounded on it long enough to be heard 3 floors down, according to a typed incident report near the bottom of the folder, before the smoke did what smoke does. One of them was the woman in the photo. Marcus thought about that shoe on the landing and didn't say anything for a good minute. When he finally asked whether the archive room used to sit inside the old East Wing, Jake flipped through a laminated floor plan clipped to the folder and went quiet himself before admitting, "Yeah, actually, dead center underneath the stairwell where Amber had seen somebody standing. Dead center under the floor where that fire door got welded shut. They should have left it right there." Marcus told himself that 100 times later, lying awake at 4 a.m., turning it over like a rock he couldn't put down. But finding her name, Eleanor, typed in that faded old font, made her feel less like a spooky rumor and more like an unfinished sentence. And stupidly, dangerously, he wanted to finish it for her. So the next shift he brought a flashlight down to the archive alone, Jake covering the radio upstairs and promising to come running if Marcus didn't check in within 20. The archive smelled like old paper and mildew, and under that, faintly, smoke with no source. Marcus found the box the folder came from, wedged behind 2 others, and inside were more photos, more reports, and at the bottom a hand-drawn map of the 3rd floor with an X over a supply closet that, on the current blueprints, didn't exist anymore, walled over during the renovation, folded invisibly into what was now the nurse's break room. He was still staring at that X when the temperature dropped again, and this time he heard it too. A slow, patient knocking from the wall to his left, like somebody who'd been knocking 50 years and had learned not to rush it. He didn't bolt right away. Wishes he could say he did, because bolting would have been the smart move. But instead he stood frozen, flashlight shaking in his hand, while the knocking got a little louder, and a stretch of bricked-over wall seemed to breathe outward for a second. A held breath finally letting go, before going still. Then the bulb flickered out, and in the dark he heard, close enough to feel warm on the back of his neck, a single whispered word he never fully explained to anyone, not even Jake. He made it up those stairs faster than he'd ever moved in his life. Jake found him in the break room, white as a sheet, not talking at first. When he finally spilled it, Jake didn't laugh, didn't wave it off, just sat with him till sunup, because his own grandma swore up and down her house was haunted, and he'd never once doubted her. Marcus put in for day shift 3 weeks later, and it went through faster than transfers usually did, which he chose not to read too much into. He never went back to that archive room, but sometimes, cutting past the 3rd floor break room, he catches himself eyeing the wall where that old supply closet used to be. And once, months later, he swears he saw the outline of a door where no door belonged on any floor plan he'd ever seen. There for a blink, then gone. Just smooth wall, waiting the way it's apparently been waiting 50 years for somebody to finally answer. Father Danny Sullivan had been the hospice chaplain at St. Cabrini's for 11 years, long enough to have sat beside more deaths than he could count, and to have mostly stopped being scared of the moment itself. What still got under his skin, even after all that time, was the hour or 2 before it, that weird burst of clarity dying patients sometimes got, speaking sharp and clear after days of fog, often to people who weren't in the room, sometimes to people who'd never existed at all. Nurses called it terminal lucidity, had a textbook explanation about brain chemistry and low oxygen, and Danny didn't doubt the science, but he'd also seen enough over the years that he'd quit pretending, at least to himself, that the science covered it all. The patient was a woman named Carol Jennings, 78, dying slow of a cancer that had already taken most of what made her recognizable to her own family, and for 3 days she'd been mostly unresponsive, drifting somewhere Danny couldn't reach. Fourth night in, a nurse called him up saying Carol was asking for a priest, and he found her sitting nearly upright, eyes suddenly clear and sharp, gripping his hand with a strength that flat out startled him. She told him, no preamble, that there was a man in the room telling her over and over it wasn't her fault, and she needed to hear it from someone with real authority whether that was true, because she didn't figure she deserved forgiveness for something the man kept swearing wasn't even a sin. Danny asked, gently, what exactly she thought she needed forgiving for. And what came out was a story he wasn't ready for, told in pieces between labored breaths. Decades back, working as a young orderly at a different hospital across the state, Carol had been assigned a ward where a kid, 9 years old, dying of something doctors back then couldn't touch, begged her, over and over, not to leave him alone at night, scared stiff of something he swore watched him from the closet at the foot of his bed. Her supervisor told her to knock it off, that babying a kid's fantasies only made things worse. So the night he died, alone, she'd been down the hall with another patient, following orders she never quite forgave herself for following. She said the man in the room now, and here her voice dropped almost to nothing, forcing Danny to lean in close, had introduced himself, if that's even the word, as an orderly from that same ward, decades before her time. Somebody who understood exactly what it costs to follow rules that end up taking a patient's life. He told her the boy never blamed her, that whatever was in the closet came for him no matter who was standing guard, and that Carol carrying that guilt for 50 years had somehow, in a way even she couldn't put into words, kept a door propped open that should have swung shut a long time ago. Danny sat with her till almost dawn, offering the kind of comfort that didn't require him to confirm or deny some ghost's existence, figuring this was probably the mind's own mercy, cooking up a figure of absolution out of guilt too heavy to haul into death alone. Carol passed 2 nights later, peaceful, hand slack in the nurse's grip at the end. Danny did the last rites and told himself that was that, filed away with the other stories a chaplain sees and doesn't bring up at dinner. Should have ended there. Didn't, because 3 weeks later a different patient down the hall, a guy named Harold with dementia bad enough that he barely strung sentences together anymore, grabbed Danny's sleeve mid-visit and asked, dead clear, whether the orderly who used to work nights was still around, because he wanted to say sorry to him too. Danny, thrown by the phrasing, asked what he meant, and Harold described a man in old-timey scrubs standing at the foot of his bed most nights. Not scary, just there, watching with a kind of patient sadness, like somebody waiting on something that kept not showing up. Danny started digging after that, quiet about it. First with the older nursing staff, then, when that got him nowhere, in the records office, where a clerk who'd worked there 30 years finally admitted, after some hemming and hawing, that St. Cabrini's had absorbed a smaller hospital's pediatric ward decades back during a merger. A smaller hospital with a history nobody advertised, of way too high overnight mortality during a stretch before modern staffing ratios were even a thing, back when one orderly might be running a whole ward solo through the night. The records didn't name names, but an old staff roster, yellowed and half illegible, listed a night orderly whose employment ended abruptly the same month as a cluster of kid deaths nobody ever formally explained. The file just noting, in careful cursive, resigned, cause unstated. Danny didn't sleep right for a while after that, turning over the idea that the man showing up for his dying patients wasn't after some kind of payback, but was seeking forgiveness himself, decade after decade, patient after patient, still trying to make good on nights he couldn't take back. He thought about bringing it to admin more than once, and talked himself out of it every time, not sure what exactly he'd even be asking them to do about a guy who might not exist outside dying minds, or might exist in some more literal sense his seminary training never touched. Instead, he started sitting longer with patients in that lucid window, listening for the orderly, the scrubs, the closet, and over the next year he heard it 4 more times, always from patients who'd have sworn on a stack of Bibles they had no way of knowing each other's stories. He started talking straight to the presence they described, offering, on behalf of whoever or whatever needed it, the forgiveness his patients seemed dead sure only a priest could hand out. He's got no proof any of it did squat. Deaths kept happening the way they do in hospice, some easy, some hard, no pattern a statistician would blink at. But Danny noticed, or figures he noticed, that mentions of the orderly slowed down after he started that quiet, private absolution thing, tapering from about one a season to this past 8 months, just heralds, repeated now practically every visit, the old man still waiting, still asking, like the apology he's carrying never quite lands. Danny sits with him longer than protocol strictly calls for, listening to the same request come out fresh every single time. And he started wondering, with a dread he keeps to himself, what happens to that figure in the old scrubs the night herald finally manages to say whatever it is he's been needing to say? And what, exactly, might get set loose once he finally does?